All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Sotok with NC Child, the Public Engagement Director here, and I want to thank all of you for joining us for this, our third in our fall series of webinars focusing on issues related to family economic security. And today we're going to be talking some about potential policy solutions and real policy solutions that are in place and working in some places, and also some proposals and some tenets of proposals that we think would be are most helpful and most evidence-based when we talk about supporting children and families and their economic mobility here in North Carolina. For those of you who are not familiar with us, NC Child is a statewide nonprofit advocacy organization, and we've been in existence for over 30 years now. And our mission is quite simple. We want to advance public policies to ensure all children, regardless of race, ethnicity, or their place of birth, have the opportunity to achieve their full potential. And in order to do that, we have some main focus areas for our work. Being multi-issue and focused on the whole child ages 0 through 17, there's obviously a lot of different issues and concerns and ways that we can go about our work. We like to divvy it. Another being family economic security, hence the conversation today. Healthy children, child health and family health being crucial towards success. The ways that we go about talk about this presentations, because we have 4 major strategies that we utilize in trying to achieve our mission. One is doing research and data analysis. And so the research that we're able to do here at NC Child and able to work collaboratively with others to get is the backbone for our advocacy strategies. It helps us understand what policies will work, what the data says, and how we can move forward. Strategic communications, this is another important aspect of our work. Quite simply, we have to be able to get the message out about what are some effective ways to change things and public policies that we support, et cetera. And so we have to be able to communicate with a broad spectrum of people across the state in order to achieve our goals. Direct advocacy. So we do lobby in the North Carolina legislature. We go directly to elected leaders in Raleigh and talk to them about some of these policy solutions. And we also work with many of you who do direct advocacy to your elected leaders at the state, local, national levels to talk to them about some of these solutions. Last but not least, we are doing more and more community engagement. So the thought process around this is that we're never going to be able to achieve the policy solutions we want to see without a strong network of people across the state coming together and advocating and being engaged on these issues. So that's some of the background on NC Child, and we're excited today. I'm excited to have Whitney Tucker, our research director, who is going to talk in more depth about some potential policy solutions here in North Carolina. I'm going to turn it over to Whitney.
Thank you so much, Adam. And as Adam mentioned, my name is Whitney Tucker, and I'm research director here at NC Child. And I have been sort of walking through some of the basic points around the scope of the problem when we talk about child poverty in the state, but then also what we can do about it moving up to today. So this is the last webinar in our 3-part series, and I think it could be helpful, particularly for those of you who are joining us for the first time today, to go over a little bit of what we've learned thus far in our series. So first, we talked about poverty generally and what living in poverty actually means. We learned that poverty is assessed by the federal government using an outdated standard for modern family circumstances. And researchers now believe that nearly twice the federal poverty line is actually needed to sustain a family. 43% of North Carolina's children, which is about 1 million kids, live in poor or low-income homes, which means that their homes have incomes under that 200% of the federal poverty line mark. Race is relevant here. Black and Latinx children are about twice as likely as Asian and white children in the state to live in poor and low-income homes. And we also know that place and age are important. In North Carolina, younger children and children in rural areas are more likely to live in poverty than older children in those in urban areas. Children living in poverty are more likely than their peers to be exposed to events that can harm healthy brain development and limit their opportunities across the course of their lives. So without protective factors like the resilience of their caregivers or concrete supports like cash benefits and subsidized services for their families, childhood poverty has been linked to reduced success in school, greater exposure to violence, hunger and malnutrition, criminal justice involvement, both for the children themselves and for their parents and caregivers, child abuse and neglect, and reduced earnings in adulthood. Those reduced earnings are especially important when we talk about economic mobility, which is something that we talked a little bit about in the last webinar in our series, in the previous webinar. And in this one, we really want to say a little bit more about what impacts economic mobility and what policies work to change it. Economic mobility is broadly defined as the ability of an individual, family, or some other group to change their economic status. And so that status is usually measured in movement between income quintiles. So from the bottom to the top 20% of earners, for example. In North Carolina, our mobility lags behind the rest of the nation. Only 1 in 3 children born into poverty in North Carolina manages to climb into a higher income threshold as an adult. And although upward mobility is poor in both rural and urban areas of our state, place is still very important for children who are growing up in poverty. Geography changes a child's ability to access resources that have shown statistical relevance to upward mobility and resources which often shift from neighborhood to neighborhood. So race also plays a big role here because racist policy decisions have concentrated families of color in under-resourced geographic areas, as well as underpaid occupations with institutionalized racial disparities in wages and benefits. Racism also perpetuates employment and education discrimination that make it extremely difficult for people of color, particularly Black men, to break into higher income brackets and then to stay there. But we'll talk a little bit more about the research on that in a bit. So now that we've all had a quick refresher on the scope of child poverty in the state, I want to move on to the policy solutions that can make a difference in pushing children and their families from low-income homes to higher income levels in adulthood. So I'm getting us started with information that I did share in our last webinar, but just to remind us of the factors that have been proven to be statistically significant predictors of economic mobility. These factors were all associated with higher mobility for children in a study on anonymous earnings and demographic data of nearly all Americans who are currently in their late 30s. It was a little bit over 40 million people. The study was conducted by Stanford and Harvard economists working alongside demographers from the US Census Bureau. What works to break the cycle of family poverty will essentially be what works to promote these factors down to the neighborhood level. And the best policy approaches will tackle more than one of these issues at once. The first policy strategy that I want to highlight is deconcentrating poverty. When implemented effectively, this strategy is effective because it tackles multiple drivers of economic mobility at once. This, combined with really startling recent increases in concentrated poverty rates, has made deconcentrating poverty a really popular strategy in cities across the nation that are struggling with social mobility. Although North Carolina is consistently rated really high on lists of best places to live in national surveys of where people would like to move, due to our wage, salary, and job growth, and then increases in our high-tech clusters, at the same time, the state has also been increasing in concentrated poverty, which is really just showing that economic opportunity is not being spread evenly statewide. A 2014 Brookings report studied the growth in concentrated poverty by measuring the number of census tracts that had more than 20% of the families in that census tract living below the poverty line. As you can see in this table from that study, poverty became far more concentrated in some of the larger cities in North Carolina following the 2008 Great Recession. In the year 2000, Winston-Salem, for example, had only 2 census tracts with more than 20% of families below poverty. So another way of looking at that is to say that most families living in poverty in Winston-Salem at the time were likely to be living in the same neighborhood as families from other income levels. But by 2008 to 2012, that number of census tracts with concentrated poverty had increased from 2 to 19, with 41% of poor residents in the city living in those high poverty neighborhoods. So why does this matter? Children's opportunities for economic mobility are largely shaped by the neighborhoods in which they grow up. For this reason, place-focused approaches to improving mobility can be very effective when they're well implemented. And I've included a simple chart here to explain generally why these sorts of policies work. As we go through each of the major policy-focused areas, you'll see this same layout on the slide. So I've started with the general policy approach as a title, but then I'm talking about how it changes outcomes in economic mobility. And then in the chart, just quickly explaining why, referring back to those drivers of economic mobility that we just saw. And then at the bottom of the slide, just showing some ways that might show up in specific policy proposals. So a significant childhood exposure effect to growing up in a high opportunity neighborhood has now been proven through various studies. We know now that every extra year that a child spends growing up in an area where permanent residents' incomes are higher than their original neighborhood increases that child's income in adulthood. So the adult outcomes of people who move to a high poverty area or a high opportunity area converge with those of permanent residents at a rate of about 4% per year of childhood exposure. And I know this is kind of wonky, but it's important because what it's telling us is that we can, that not only are policy changes that we make early in children's lives having a really marked effect on their later success, but it also implies that a lot of the variation that we see in intergenerational mobility across by the causal effects of place rather than any actual differences in the types of people living in various places. So over time, outcomes among different people become more similar based on the fact that they lived in the same neighborhood. Now, with that said, research indicates that hyperlocal solutions are best here. Study has to be done to understand what makes each specific neighborhood produce better outcomes than another neighborhood in order to know where exactly families should be encouraged to move and how to invest to best improve their mobility. So in practice, this might look like housing vouchers that enable families to move from one area to another, or public transportation investments that improve mobility between neighborhoods, or preservation of low-income housing in gentrified and gentrifying areas to ensure continued integration. The details are important here, though, when we're considering local efforts to deconcentrate poverty, because policies in this area are often implemented to be politically favorable at the expense of low-income families. We see this problem show up when there's, for example, mandatory rather than voluntary housing voucher programs that displace low-income residents, but then free up public housing for physical redevelopment and property investment. We also see it in things like restrictive neighborhood zoning that keeps low-income families from being able to move anywhere, but from one low opportunity area to another, even with vouchers made available to them. So when implemented poorly, efforts to deconcentrate poverty become efforts to simply relocate poor people in ways that don't offend or alienate the non-poor. And this makes them really ineffective at producing intergenerational economic security. So now onto our next point, which is going to require a quick dive into economics because the larger state of the economy does play a clear role in social mobility and opportunities for children to move out of poverty. Promoting economic growth, particularly equitable economic growth, is critical to improving economic mobility. Researchers have defined a clear period of high mobility nationwide that lasted from 1940 to 1970, mobility from 1980 through 2010. The key differences between these periods are that the first was characterized by high economic growth and low income inequality, while the second had high income inequality and a lower rate of economic growth. Obviously, any proposal that could address both of these things would nearly certainly increase economic mobility. But if just one policy choice could be made, study from the same Stanford Harvard Census Bureau team that I referenced earlier found that returning income inequality to its earlier lower rate would have a larger impact on economic mobility than simply boosting economic growth to its higher earlier rate. A faster growing economy, but one that still has a large divide between the highest and the lowest incomes, moves families out of poverty, but the increase in mobility is much higher when slower growth is just distributed more equitably. So put simply, a growing economy without a strong middle class just perpetuates poverty. North Carolina continues to struggle with a very inequitable economic system. Income is concentrated at the very top, with the highest paid 5% of earners holding nearly $1 in every $4 of income generated in the state in 2018. To put that into perspective, the people in that highest paid 5% of state residents collected nearly the same amount of income in 2018 as the bottom 60% of North Carolinians. This means trouble for economic mobility in the state. We currently have a system where the majority of people, even employed, earn too little to support their families, and they give back more of their earnings through taxes than those with higher incomes. So for those who aren't familiar, this is what's known as a regressive tax system, wherein higher earning individuals pay a smaller percentage of income in taxes than those making less money than them. So you'll see under the in practice section that progressive taxation is one way that this sort of imbalance is shifted in some economies that try this out. And it's really just the exact opposite. So folks who earn more money pay more in taxes than those who earn less.
And from a practical standpoint too, which from a policy standpoint, something that springs to mind to me is the work that NC Child did along with many other organizations fighting the constitutional income tax cap that was put into place here in North Carolina, Tabor type law that we call it, because it goes in the face of progressive taxation, and it puts a cap on those higher earners essentially in income tax.
That's a perfect example of a policy that would have actively made the economic system less equitable, even if we had experienced economic growth at the same time, right? North Carolina's economy really relies on consumer spending. So the problem that you see here with an inequitable level of growth really quickly becomes self-perpetuating. So when working families can't earn enough to pay for the necessities of life, they then spend less, which in turn causes businesses to operate at a loss, and it slows the entire economy as well as individual mobility out of poverty. Policies that lead to more equitable economic growth benefit mobility because they promote the creation of higher paying jobs, which lead to reduced segregation by income as people can afford to move to areas of high opportunity. They strengthen the tax base, which increases school quality at the local level, and they increase household income, which regardless of size helps to offset the difficulty that families with fewer heads of household have compared to families with more. So thinking about a single parent household versus a two parent household, that it is easier to afford basic needs if you have a higher income, even if you have to have a single parent household where there is less cost sharing. And then finally, throwing a complicated wrench into all of the findings that we've already discussed, we need to talk about race. I told you guys in the last webinar that race is not predictive of economic mobility at the individual level, but it is at the population level. So keep that in mind now as we dig a little bit deeper. I'm going to focus a lot on the Black-white divide, but I want to note that I'm doing that because the difference in economic mobility outcomes is most pronounced between these two groups. Even considering all of the differences by place and policy that we've already discussed, recent studies show that the worst places for the mobility of white children in low-income families are nearly all better than the best places for the mobility of Black kids in low-income families. The New York Times really summed it up in their coverage of the new research on this issue that was released last year. It said that part of the reason the Southeast looks so bad for children is that the region is home to many Black children who fare particularly poorly there. Now, Black girls and women face deep inequality on many measures, but Black and white girls from families with comparable earnings go on to have similar individual incomes as adults. In fact, Black girls go on to earn slightly more than white girls raised in families with a similar income. So some of the earlier strategies that we've talked about that increase access to high opportunity resources like good schools and high paying jobs can be really effective in promoting equitable outcomes for Black and white girls. In contrast to that, we see that even when Black and white boys are raised in families with similar backgrounds, Black boys go on to earn less than white boys. This difference is noticeable and persistent across all incomes. We know that this disparity is the result of a social barrier for Black boys because researchers looked into it more and found that the earnings gap persisted even when Black and white boys grew up in families with the same income, similar family structures, similar education levels, and similar levels of accumulated wealth. The disparities also can't be explained by differences in cognitive ability, which is an argument that some people have made, usually pointing to racial differences in test scores. Those racial differences appear for both Black boys and girls when compared to white boys and girls, however. So if cognitive differences actually existed by race, we'd see them handicapping Black girls' economic mobility in similar ways to that of Black boys. But that's not what these charts show. These findings tell us that it's more likely that the standardized tests are just poorly measuring the abilities of Black children and feeding into persistent and racist narratives about differing abilities among people of different races. The research makes clear that there is something unique about the obstacles Black males face. Researchers have found that Black boys have lower incomes in adulthood than white boys in 99% of census tracts, even among boys who grow up in the same areas in families with similar incomes. The gap between Latino and white boys is narrower, and their incomes actually converge within a couple of generations if mobility patterns stay the same. Asian Americans earn more than whites raised at the same income level, or about the same when first-generation immigrants are excluded. Only Native Americans have an income gap comparable to African Americans, but the disparities are still widest for Black boys. These results show that differences in neighborhood-level resources, like the quality of schools, cannot explain by themselves the intergenerational gaps between Black and white boys. That's where efforts aimed directly at combating racist ideology and practice can make a real difference. So combating racism then is a strategy that has to be tackled all on its own in order to improve economic mobility, particularly for Black men. Now, if we're able to do that, outcomes maps for the entire country could change because essentially the huge barriers that Black children continue to face are dragging down our average outcomes in most areas. We saw this on the maps, particularly in the Southeast, where most Black children in the country currently live. Researchers have suggested that initiatives whose impacts cross neighborhood and class lines, and which increase upward mobility specifically for Black men, hold the greatest promise of narrowing the Black-white gap. By focusing on the particular reasons that Black men are less likely to grow up out of poverty, and also to hold on to wealth, even if they're born into it, we have to ask questions that are bigger than just economic circumstance. There are lots of promising examples of different practices and efforts that might address this. Things like mentoring programs for Black boys, efforts to reduce racial bias among white people, interventions to reduce discrimination in criminal justice, and efforts to facilitate greater interaction across racial groups. If we're going to make a difference in improving overall economic mobility outcomes, we're going to need to directly name racial discrimination against Black children and Black boys in particular as a barrier, and invest in reducing racism the way we would any other socioeconomic problem?
Thanks so much, Whitney. That was an amazing overview of these issues in North Carolina, combined with history that very much matters. And so I wanted to just take just a minute here. I know we're coming up on 12:30, and I encourage anyone, if you've got any questions, click on the Q&A box in the top of your screen there, and we will get to those and answer those questions. But I wanted to talk about just some efforts happening here in North Carolina that are trying to address these issues around economic mobility. And these are all works in progress, and there's some data coming out on the effects and the positive effects of some of these models. And there's others where there'll be more to come. But one thing that's been going on in North Carolina is, I think based upon the poor economic mobility scores and data that we've seen come down the line in recent years, particularly with that, I think, Harvard study that came out a few years ago, I think it's put some folks on alert to go, oh my goodness, we really do have a problem here, and how do we address this? And so you're starting to see more local initiatives. And two in particular that I'm aware of is the Leading on Opportunity effort in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, as well as the Partnership for Prosperity effort in Winston-Salem, where they're trying to bring folks together, and have sort of a collective impact look at what are some policies we can push forward as a community at the local level to try to increase economic mobility and address some of these issues. Another model, and that's out there and that's being utilized in North Carolina, as well as other places across the country, is the purpose-built communities model. And so that we see that coming out in examples of Southeast Raleigh Promise, Renaissance West Community Initiative down in Charlotte, and then East Durham Children's Initiative. And East Durham Children's Initiative is one that I'm most familiar with as far as seeing some data that's come out showing that the services that are happening as a result of this program and really trying to purposely work in a community is starting to show some payoffs and starting to show some good results, 7 or 8 years in.
Right. I do want to note that obviously with these sort of interventions, it's difficult to know if they're going to impact intergenerational mobility in a short period of time, but that these are exactly the types of things that research is pointing to and saying that this is the way to go about addressing this problem with this hyper-local focus, because people are able to more accurately assess what is different in one neighborhood to the next that is actually making the difference for kids.
Yeah, it's a great point. And then another really recent model, and one that happens often, I guess, in North Carolina in different places and has varied success, is the city of Durham in this most recent election actually had a housing bond on the ballot. And it passed by a whopping margin, 77-23. And this will basically this will be combined with other money that the city is going in to, I think, create a pot of like $160 million that will go towards, low-income housing for folks, trying to get homeless population into housing and more stable situations, and kind of work within a context of increased gentrification and rising costs, certainly in the city of Durham. That's not unique and is being seen in a lot of other urban areas. And so it's just interesting because it is that model of really everyone in the community, putting something into the pot in order to help make this happen and make sure that we're trying to uplift everyone. And that's why I wanted to put on this slide, the example of the impact of what you're seeing, which is basically about $40 more on a property tax bill for, someone in a median valued house in the community. And unfortunately, we see these type efforts sometimes being really hard to pass at the local level because of that whole taxation issue and debate. But, at the end of the day, it's kind of like, how are we valuing our community and helping make it a better place. And I certainly would say, 37 more bucks on a property tax bill for someone is affordable and is a positive way to go given the impact you're going to have.
Right, and I would just add to that based on what we know about the way that our stalling economic mobility is affecting the state's economic growth, that they're really feeding off of each other, that it really is in everyone's best interest, not only morally, but from an economic perspective, to invest in each other.
Yep, absolutely. So those are just some examples. I'm sure many of you may have other examples and other things that we could bring forward, and we'd be happy to hear about those too after the webinar if you have any other examples. As I just wanted to mention and give a few minutes here again for questions and answers. If anyone would like to ask a question right now, we could try to answer those. We'll give it just a minute here.
Yeah, I feel like we covered a lot, so don't be shy.
And again, we will have all of these webinars are recorded. We're going to have them living on our YouTube channel, and I'll be sending out summary and information to everyone who's registered for these webinars as a reminder. And hopefully you all can encourage other folks to go on and listen to these webinars as well. Seeing no open questions at this time, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap the webinar up. Any last words, Whitney?
No, I just want to say that it's really important that we make sure that we're investing early, that the research says that the sooner we make these changes for kids, that it does actually have a bigger impact over time if we do it earlier. So, if you're waffling about getting engaged with a local effort around economic mobility in your area, that you should definitely jump in.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you everyone, and we'll be in touch. Bye.